Greetings and welcome to Talk a Little, Learn a Lot, the American Society of Naval Engineers podcast. I am your host, Stephen Phillips. In this podcast, we talk a little and learn a lot about naval engineering while inspiring the next generation of STEM professionals. I first encountered Savannah on the James River. I was visiting my aunt and uncle in the greater Norfolk area, and we cruised up to see the Ghost Fleet, the deactivated ships moored there. We were struck by the white ship that appeared to be part cargo ship, part cruise liner. To start, the ship was painted white and her lines looked graceful, almost elegant. But then, with a superstructure aft and a number of cargo handling derricks, she appeared like a Group 3 merchant. As we got closer, the atomic symbol could be seen on the superstructure. I can remember saying out loud, "What is that, a nuclear-powered cargo ship?" We identified the ship as Savannah, and so hours later, I looked her up online and was introduced to all things about this very interesting ship. I have been enthralled with Savannah ever since. Savannah is now in Baltimore, not far from where I live. Thus, I had the opportunity to visit in 2018 during National Maritime Day. I took hundreds of photos as I enjoyed a guided tour of the ship. And then I visited again recently during an open house on November 16th with other ASNI members. Today, I look forward to sharing Savannah's story with the Talk a Little, Learn a Lot audience. And to that end, I'm joined by Erhard Koehler to learn about the Nuclear Ship Savannah. Again, a unique cargo and passenger vessel that, as implied in her name, is nuclear powered. Erhard, thank you for joining me on the podcast. I look forward to this discussion.
Steve, it's my pleasure, and I look forward to it as well.
Well, Erhard, let's start with introductions. Please share with the Talk a Little, Learn a Lot audience your background, your role with the Maritime Administration, and your connection to Savannah.
Well, thanks, Steve. I should tell you that I am a former AS&E member back in my original career life. I am a degreed naval architect. I graduated from SUNY Maritime College in Fort Schuyler in 1987 and went to work for the late great Philadelphia Naval Shipyard. And that had been my ambition growing up and being a lifelong lover of ships, and in particular battleships and other naval ships. I really wanted to join the Navy. I didn't quite make it into Annapolis. Could not make the cut to Coast Guard, and wound up at SUNY Maritime by way of Webb Institute because I really wanted the degree in naval architecture. Did try to get in the Navy while I was at SUNY. Had an unfortunate bout of honesty at my entrance exam at Fort Hamilton and was told thank you, but no. So I ended up working for the Navy rather than being in the Navy, and it was very rewarding. Of course, 1987 is just on the cusp of the fall of the Berlin Wall, and so at Philly, we went from building the ships, building and repairing and modernizing the 600 ship Navy to deactivating it and decommissioning it, all within the arc of about my 4 years at PNSY. The yard was identified in the first BRAC round, the first Base Realignment and Closure Commission for closure. And I happened to be the first rat off the sinking ship. My wife, also a graduate of SUNY Maritime, was getting the placement bulletin. I applied for a job as a marine surveyor at MARAD in the Office of Ship Operations, Division of Ship Maintenance and Repair. And in the days before LinkedIn and things, when you went to interview, you didn't know who you were interviewing with. When I was asked what I knew about MARAD, I knew the traditional things. Being an avid amateur maritime historian, I knew the things that MARAD had classically done, like the subsidy programs and the like. And I mentioned school ships and Savannah. What I didn't know was that Joe Seelinger, the gentleman interviewing me, had been a member of the MARAD backup crew on Savannah in 63, 64, and had taken the ship to sea, including riding through the hurricane in September of 64. So I immediately went to the top of the list and I got the job. So I was a Marine surveyor working in MARAD's management of the Ready Reserve Force, which I think is probably familiar to most of your audience. I was in ship ops, and Savannah at the time was towards the end of her tenure as a museum ship at Patriots Point Naval and Maritime Museum outside Charleston, along with the Yorktown. She pinholed in the fall of 1992 and an after cargo hold. And the nature of the charter was such that Marad owned the ship and was responsible for underwater hull maintenance. And it became obvious that we were going to have, in 93, that we were going to have to dry dock the ship to make repairs. And Patriots Point said, "Hey, Marad, when you take the ship away, don't bring it back." And of course, I got the task to take the ship away and put it through dry dock. And basically, I've been with it ever since. Um, the folks there were only a handful of folks in 1994 when we brought the ship back who had any direct experience with Savannah. So I learned through them. And ultimately in 2004, when Joe retired, I became MARAD's licensee. So essentially, I am the person who holds, I don't literally hold the NRC, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission license for the nuclear power plant, but I represent the agency as the license holder. And I represent the agency in all matters before the NRC. I'm also the program manager for all aspects of the ship, which generally include its custodial care and its stewardship as a National Historic Landmark. So all of that kind of rolled in, and that's been my full-time gig basically since 2007. I did other things along the way, managing the training ships and so on and so forth, but that's all a different topic of conversation.
Let's start with the basics, the who, what, when, where, and why of Savannah. So, who was the inspiration for this nuclear powered cargo ship? Who designed and built Savannah? Where and when was she built? And then when was she active?
Well, the popular notion is that President Eisenhower had the idea to build the ship. Um, I think if you read Ned Beach's autobiography, that there was an admiral who may have had the germ of the idea, but Eisenhower embraced it very early on, and it was in early 1954. So we like to fantasize that Mamie christened Nautilus in the spring of '94. We like to imagine her getting on the train to come back from Groton down to Washington, D.C., and Ike greets her when she gets back to the White House, says, how was your day? And has that kernel of inspiration to build a nuclear powered merchant ship. It's probably not exactly that way. But what we do know from researching a variety of different repositories of Savannah material, including records from the Eisenhower administration at the archive and the Presidential Library in Abilene, that the idea of adding a nuclear-powered merchant ship to the nation's Atoms for Peace program was assigned to the National Security Council for review and debate in early 1954, so around that same time frame. And it was debated for about a year. But Ike was the kind of guy who didn't quite delegate things. I mean, he did delegate, but once the job was done, it was his to do. And so he very publicly announced the addition of the nuclear-powered merchant ship to the program in April of 1955. It was kind of a surprise. It was at a press conference at the Waldorf Astoria, and it was not known beforehand that he was going to make this announcement. So it is truly conceived of and believed to be Eisenhower's ship. And as any good ship owner, Eisenhower set some interesting design requirements for the vessel that are expressed in the ship as it was built. Rickover was not the only person to grasp the potential for nuclear technology for ship propulsion. MARAD was looking at it roughly from about the same time. They just didn't have a submarine program to be the catalyst for going forward. There are a lot of operational advantages to nuclear power that can be realized in a commercial setting as well as in a naval setting. So there was this perception that nuclear power could take the place of fossil fuel boilers. MARAD was doing design studies by the time Eisenhower had proposed this and was looking at ships that might be, if not economically competitive, nearly competitive, particularly large bulk carriers or oil tankers. And Ike said, no, this ship has to carry passengers. You can't put a tanker out there. Nobody's going to believe it's safe unless there actually are people on board. You made I think the observation uniquely designed for passengers and cargo, which really isn't the case. Passenger cargo ships were very common types of ship all throughout, the most of the 20th century. They really only started dying out in the 70s, but they were that intermediate type of vessel between a pure cargo ship and a fast express liner. Something had to serve the intermediate and the smaller trades, and passenger cargo ships did that quite well. So it was not unusual in that respect, but Eisenhower demanded that it be aesthetically pleasing. So, you were right when you thought of it as maybe like a Group 3 merchant, and I know that's kind of the naval classification, but she was a very standard C4 Mariner hull that was given a lot of shear, a lot of flare, a lot of curved steel, which is very expensive and nobody likes to pay for unless you're the government, to be made attractive. But it was also significantly given only half as much cargo gear as a standard C4 cargo ship. So it became a fairly inefficient cargo ship. And Eisenhower accepted that limitation. He told Marad, don't worry about shipping economics. If that's what you're aiming for, that's all anyone will judge you on. And the program is not designed to do that. So don't worry about, rate of return. And so the ship famously achieved that objective. It's not nearly as inefficient or as money losing as it might have been, but certainly it was not the most efficient or economical um, you know, efficient or economical merchant ship out there. And that's not a fault of Marad, because Marad was designing ships that were highly competitive and had been since its antecedents as the shipping board in World War One. So that's kind of the setting for it. Eisenhower wanted the ship principally to be a showcase for the peaceful uses of nuclear technology to advance the betterment of mankind, as he put it in the Atoms for Peace speech in 1953. And that meant trying to take the focus away from the military use of the technology and devote the world's attention to the things that could benefit humankind, not just in the generation of electricity that's too cheap to meter, but also in terms of industrial applications, medical uses. And of course, we have realized so many of those over the decades, where nuclear technologies promised great things for humankind and had delivered. Commercial ship propulsion was one of those places where people thought it would pan out, but in practice turned out it could not. But Eisenhower was less interested in developing the technology for practical application and rather in showcasing it to people around the world where they lived, which was important because, merchant ships of that era, and Eisenhower intuitively understood this. He well understood the value of the merchant marine from his wartime experience. He understood that merchant ships in the pre-jet age bound peoples of the world together, right? Like nothing else, because we were not flying on 707s or DC-8s yet. We weren't crossing the Atlantic in a half a day instead of in 4 or 5 or 6. So the idea of a civilian merchant ship being something that can bridge the divides, the gaps between nations, was very important. And he viewed the program primarily to meet that objective. And he wished for it to be more timely than it turned out to be, because he was perceiving that there was a moment that could be lost if we didn't do it. Congress, on the other hand, was less interested in that and more interested in the practical applications of the technology. And so they wanted a ship that would be a prototype that could not necessarily be the first of many copies, but the first to go out and prove how you use the technology in maritime commerce. We're at the cusp at that time of the first generation of commercial nuclear power. We're learning what it means to license the technology and the material for use on land. And simultaneously, we're going to try to figure out not only how to use it at sea in a commercial application, but to take it to foreign nations and operate in foreign nations under US law and regulation. We have the International Maritime Organization under the auspices of the UN to establish international frameworks for shipping that are then common because nations have adopted those. They've adopted those treaties and ratified them, and they enter into effect and they become binding. Even if you haven't ratified it, it becomes binding because you're part of the UN. There's no such analog for nuclear. There wasn't then, there isn't today. That's not the job of the International Atomic Energy Agency. It may become that, but it's not the job today. And so if you can imagine, and this is, you're thinking about this back in that day, but you can also think about it today. we all most of us live in proximity to a commercial nuclear power plant. I live 10 miles from Peach Bottom I live in northern Harford County in Maryland. I'm 10 miles and 600 feet from the epicenter of Peach Bottom Atomic Power Station. And if you were to take Peach Bottom and lift it bodily up and take it to France, plop it down in the middle of France, and expect the French to allow it to operate on French soil in the middle of France under U.S. law and regulation and U.S. licensing, that's what a nuclear merchant ship is, basically. You're taking this domestic facility and you're taking it around the world and operating it in other countries. That's really what the ship's mission was about, was to figure out how do you do that? Okay. In many senses, Savannah established the precedent for what is modern port state control, because all of these foreign nations had the opportunity to review in detail the technical information about Savannah's power plant to make a decision that they would in fact allow it to come into their waters and operate in their waters. And that is, the essence today of what port state control is. So that was the design objectives. Those were the two differing design objectives. And what you find is that the passenger cargo ship actually neatly allowed you to do both. It really was a perfect solution. And the passengers, such as they were, and there were quite a few of them, the ship was always booked for the years that it was carrying passengers, were, if you would say, willing guinea pigs in the experiment. They were there and they could demonstrate without wearing dosimetry that they were safe traveling on this ship, and as you enjoyed in the Eisenhower room in our presentation a couple of weeks ago, we were 50 feet away from the thumping core of the reactor where I was giving the presentation, and that's where the passengers were throughout the voyage. Was they were right, very close distance. You don't get that. The only place you get that close to a reactor is on a submarine, right? And the people that are on the submarine, they're being paid to be there. These are people who are paying for the privilege to be there. So that was that. The surface navy had started to be built. Submarines were being built, and there was a desire on the part of MARAD to try to expand the footprint of the yards that were building nuclear-powered ships. General Dynamics, Quincy, and Newport News Shipbuilding were building the Enterprise and the first of the cruisers and the DLGNs that became later reclassified as cruisers, Truxton, Bainbridge, and Long Beach. And so MARAD initially sought out Newport News to build Savannah, but they didn't have the capacity. Neither did Quincy, General Dynamics. So New York Ship was selected. And New York Ship was not a bad choice. New York Ship was a top-tier yard in Camden, New Jersey at the time. They had been established right around World War I, or shortly before World War I, and they had constructed any number of large merchant and naval vessels, the battleship South Dakota during World War II, other battleships in World War I and pre-World War I. Saratoga, the original Lexington-class battlecruiser / aircraft carrier Saratoga, was built at New York Ship. So New York Ship had a fine record. It was one of the first large yards that closed in the late 60s, but that had little to do with Savannah. And so New York Ship was a good choice, and they built a fine ship. The contract was awarded in 1957. The program, when it was finally authorized by Congress, was a joint program between MARAD and the former Atomic Energy Commission, which is today the US DOE plus the NRC. And so the Atomic Energy Commission let the contract for the nuclear power plant. That went to Babcock and Wilcox in Lynchburg, Virginia. And MARAD contributed the ship, and that contract went to New York Shipbuilding in Camden. We also contracted the operating company. States Marine Lines was the first of the two operating companies. And those contracts were let in 57. The keel laying was in 58. Pat Nixon officiated, wife of Vice President Nixon, which was an indicator of the national significance of the program. And the following year, in July of 59, maybe Eisenhower christened the ship when it was launched. And it had a protracted construction and testing program for the nuclear power plant because, unlike Nautilus, no prototype was built in advance. So the ship's power plant was its own prototype, and so it had to go through extensive commercial testing in order to be authorized to load the fuel and then begin low-level testing under nuclear, first criticality and low-level nuclear power tests. So the ship, in fact, was not completed and delivered to the government until May of 62, which at that point was well after Eisenhower had left office. And that's kind of where Eisenhower felt that the moment had been lost. If it was lost to Ike, it wasn't lost to the public, because the public reacted, with great interest and enthusiasm. Tens of thousands of people would visit the ship wherever it went. So it really was quite successful in that regard. And that aspect of its mission, it did very, very well.
Erhard, naturally for this audience, we'll get into the engineering plant, but let's talk a little bit about other aspects of the ship's design. What type of cargo did Savannah carry? And could you talk to us about how she was, uniquely designed for the passengers, and how she had all it just describes sort of the creature comforts that the passengers enjoyed?
Sure. So, a passenger cargo ship, typically carried anywhere upwards of 100 to 120 passengers. Some of the ships were smaller, maybe 50 or 60, and Savannah fit in the smaller range at 60. And she fit there not because that's what she was designed for, but because Congress appropriated $18 million to build a $21 million ship. So something had to give. So the number of passengers and some of the more automated cargo features that were intended for the blind cargo hold were not fitted because of cost. So in a sense, she maybe had more public amenities for 60 passengers than she might have had. Otherwise, she really was sized for 100. By comparison, the last of the U.S. flag passenger cargo ships were built, 4 ships built for Grace Lines here in Baltimore at Sparrows Point by 1964, and they were 120 passenger ships, and they had roughly the same type of outfit that Savannah has. The ship, States Marine Lines was a non-subsidized operator in world trade, so they had a fleet of ships that were, some were on liner service, some were on tramp service, and they basically sailed anywhere from from Conus to anywhere in the world, right? They traveled Far East, South America, Europe, and Africa. Had States Marine Lines continued with the operation of the ship, you might have seen Savannah go virtually anywhere around the world. And it was modeled on a round-the-world passenger cargo ship of the type that American President Lines operated from its antecedents as Dollar Line in the 20s and 30s up through APL ran those ships until about the early 70s. So it really had the capacity to travel anywhere around the world and be somewhat self-sufficient in doing so with central laundry and so forth. But States Marine Lines fell afoul after the first year of operation to a minor problem, and the minor problem, which was really something that only the government project could successfully deal with, was the differential rates of pay among the different pay scales for the crew, right? So you had 5 different unions that represented the crew on Savannah. You had a radio operators union. You had a union for the stewards department. You had a union for the unlicensed deck and engine crew together. You had a union for the licensed engineering officers and the licensed deck officers. And interestingly enough, the first of the unions that refused to sail the ship over the rate of pay were the radio operators. And so the ship did not travel on its maiden voyage to Savannah, Georgia in May of 1962 to observe the anniversary of SS Savannah, because the radio operators didn't want to sail. So the ship wound up going later in the year in August. Historically, there was a differential rate of pay between deck officers and engineering officers of about 8%, and the engineers on Savannah felt the differential should be somewhat less because of their responsibility for the nuclear power plant. The deck officers objected. It went to arbitration sponsored by the Department of Labor, and the deck officers won, which kind of torqued off the engineers. MARAD was sympathetic to the engineers until the Secretary of Labor called the Secretary of Commerce. The agency was then in the Department of Commerce, and said, hey, get with the program. We had arbitration. You've got to stick. The government arbitrated this. You have to stick with us. And so States Lines kind of got left out in the cold. MARAD wanted States to solve the problem. States was reluctant to do anything that would affect their 70 other ships in trade. It became intractable. The engineers refused to sail the ship in the spring of '63, and then they were fired, and then States was fired. And American Exporters Branson Lines was brought in as the replacement ship operating company because they had a single officer union. Now, they had been the passenger agents for Savannah for states, which didn't operate passenger ships of its own. So they already had some familiarity with Savannah. And what had been an inter-union fight became an intra-union fight. And all of a sudden, there was labor, peace, and harmony, and the ship operated just fine for the balance of its career. And there's an excellent book on the subject. There was a three-member arbitration board in New York. The arbitrator who heard the case was named Gellhorn. One of the other arbitrators was the faculty advisor to a doctoral student at Harvard later in the 60s. So he sponsored a dissertation that led to the PhD that then led to the full-length book that was published in 1970 called Savannah Saga. And it's quite interesting, framing the whole thing in the context of automation and unionization in the U.S. Merchant Marine in the 1960s. American Export had specific trade routes. It was a subsidized operator. And so it was serving essential trade routes of the United States as defined by the Department of Commerce. So it traded from the U.S. East Coast, Hoboken, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Norfolk, to Northern Europe, through to the Mediterranean, to Southern Europe, to Africa, to the Middle East, or via the Panama Canal to the Far East. It did trade to Japan. Savannah didn't go to Japan, would have gone to Japan. This is another one of these myths and legends that abound about the ship. Would have gone to Japan had it operated into 1971. The Japanese approved 4 ports for it to call. The whole issue of calling in Japan was caught up in issues of nuclear indemnification and the need of the Japanese Diet to amend their constitution to permit their own nascent nuclear power program, including a nuclear merchant ship. So until they had the constitution, jiggered so that they could do their own thing, they weren't going to let somebody else's commercial ship come in. Now, we had sent a submarine or two to Japan before, but not a big commercial ship. So Savannah would have gone to Japan if it had operated to 71, but she did go to the Far East, she did go to Hong Kong and so forth. So those were the trade routes she served, and she would carry whatever cargo happened to be available on those trade routes. Now, she's a break bulk ship, she's not a container ship. So she's carrying, palletized cargo, crated cargo, oversized cargo. She didn't have heavy lift booms of her own, so she would have relied for project cargo on shoreside cranes. And there's some photographs of the ship in Hoboken with a large floating crane doing outsized cargo. She would carry POVs for service members. She actually carried Sky Raiders to Israel on a voyage, and interesting for the peaceful nuclear merchant ship to be carrying, warcraft. So. She was banned from a couple of Middle Eastern ports as a result, because she had called in Israel. She couldn't go to other ports, as the Arabs would do back in the 60s. But famously, she carried a lot of Turkish tobacco. If your listeners are interested in old time radio and listen to the old Dragnet episodes, for a long time it was sponsored by Chesterfield, and before that, some other cigarette company that featured Turkish tobacco. It was very mild. And so Savannah carried a lot of Turkish tobacco from the Med back to the U.S. East Coast, and was fitted with dehumidification to the cargo holds in 67 for that purpose. So, we have manifests. It's hard to say exactly what she carried, but, if somebody wanted to do the research, they could figure it out.
And for the passengers, I'm interested in what life was like for them. And I'm also curious, did they come aboard just for leisure, sort of, I'll go out for a voyage and come back, or was it transportation? I'll take the ship and I'll go from, say, Baltimore to Rotterdam, and then, off to do something else. How did they embark and enjoy Savannah?
I imagine it was a little bit of both. American Export operated passenger ships, so they operated the Independence, the Constitution, the Atlantic. They also had the 4 Aces, the first 2 of which were laid up, I think, around the early 60s, and the other 2 operated through the 60s. So they had dedicated passenger service, particularly to the Mediterranean, and it was really all to the Mediterranean, because I think Independence, Constitution, Atlantic really serviced the Med, and not necessarily Northern Europe. But their freighters all could carry 12 passengers, right? So they had a dozen or more C3s in different classes that that traded on those same routes and could carry 12 passengers, and very often did, because it was an economical way for people to travel. Uh, Folks who traveled on Savannah, because the ship was open to the public when it was in port, and because there were uh, strict limitations on the numbers of visitors that could be on board under the license, under the Atomic Energy Commission license, the passengers would get kicked off when the ship was in port, right? So that they could have 60 more visitors on board, basically. Uh, and I think there were a number of folks who traveled the ship simply because it was the Savannah, and it was nuclear powered. And I think there were a number of people that traveled on the ship because it was the way to get from point A to point B at that particular moment in time. So it's a little of both. What we do know is that the ship was very popular, that it was always fully booked for the berths that were available, that it was booked well beyond 1965 when the ship stopped carrying passengers. And it stopped carrying passengers not because the service was unsuccessful, but rather because every penny of the Savannah program was on the Maritime Administration budget. And that included the cost of the passenger support operation, principally the stewards and the crew. So Savannah has a crew of about 90 to 100 people at this point, servicing passengers and cargo and so forth. And they were expensive, right? And it was more than break even. If you deleted passengers and dropped the stewards down, the crew dropped down to 65. And so the savings and the crew cost more than offset the revenue that they earned from carrying passengers. And bear in mind that 100% of the revenue went to the Department of Treasury as a receipt and did not come to MARAD to offset the budget, right? So none of that passenger revenue made MARAD's net cost less. It made the government's net cost less, but it didn't make MARAD's net cost less. So that decision in 65 had nothing to do with the popularity of the ship as a passenger carrying vessel, but everything to do with trying to economize on the cost of the program. So the amenities that they had were the standard types of things that you would see on most passenger ships, only in smaller scale. They had a pool. They had a very nice brushed copper nickel pool. They had shuffleboard courts out on the deck. They had the broad expanse of the promenade deck for outside leisure. They had the walk around enclosed promenade that you could do turns and stay dry if it was heavy weather. There was a large main lounge that doubled as a movie theater and a recreation space. There was a reading room, a small library, a card room where you could play table games. The veranda featured the cocktail lounge, the bar, the dance hall, the dance floor. You could get food there through the day. And so that's all up on the prom deck. That's the recreation deck area. You had the large main dining hall, which was attractively fitted down on B deck, and that's where you had most of your meals. There is a gallery that surrounds the engine room, a glass gallery, so that you can walk around and look down into the engine room and look into the control room while the ship is at sea. And so the passengers could do that while the ship was at sea. And the operators tended to think of themselves as being in a fishbowl as a result. It was also a feature that many dignitaries and VIPs took advantage of. And the truth be told is that there were few voyages where Savannah maxed the passenger capacity at 60. There was always somebody that was riding and taking up a passenger room, right? And they were costing the government money, right? So part of the decision to cease carrying passengers was because they could never quite get everybody out of the passenger rooms. In fact, an entire tween deck in cargo hold 6 was converted to get the trainees out of passenger rooms and free up space for paying passengers, which was lost revenue from cargo capacity. It was one of the larger tween decks on the ship that was devoted over to staterooms in a training area.
All the amenities and the architecture and the furniture, it all looks to me like it's, stopped in time in the mid 60s. And I don't know if you call it Art Deco style or how would you describe it?
It's not really mid-century modern, but it's intended to evoke an American aesthetic. We have coined the phrase. I don't know that we coined the phrase, but we've adopted the phrase the era of atomic optimism. So that's kind of where we put it.
Yeah, it reminds me almost of Star Trek. Like I could imagine the Star Trek characters walking through the lounge.
Well, there are certainly some design elements that are very reminiscent of Enterprise.
Erhard, let's delve into the engineering plant then. What are the major elements of Savannah's engineering plant?
Well, Savannah is really is in many respects, as I said, it started life derived from a C4 Mariner. Same for the naval architecture geeks, same length between perpendiculars, 2 feet deeper beam. So the lines are fleshed out a little bit. A lot of flare, a lot of shear. The engineering plant is roughly comparable to a Mariner because you're pushing the same amount of steel, the same hull form basically through the water. So about 22,000 shaft horsepower, double reduction geared steam turbines. The difference is that Savannah's plant produces saturated steam, not superheated steam. So you have moisture separators in the system. There are two of them, two large ones, one before the throttles and one between the HP and the LP turbines. Um, there is and as a consequence, of course, the diameter of the turbines is greater because to get the same energy, you need a larger volume of saturated steam than superheated steam. The plant does feature the large suite of auxiliaries, a very large air conditioning plant and electrical generation that you need for the larger hotel load, but also for the reactor load. We pumped basically, we had to cool the reactor compartment when it was time for humans to enter, right? So we had to remove a lot of heat out of the space because the reactor's operating up and around 500 degrees and it's kind of hot in there. So there was air conditioning to cool that down to get it safe for entry. The ship has two large ship service diesel generators that are uncommon. Those are on the lower level of the engine room on the starboard side. And they were there to provide power basically in the event of a scram, as a shutdown of the reactor. One diesel generator was dedicated to vital loads, and the other would supply power to an auxiliary propulsion motor. So we had a 600 horsepower electric motor that was clutched to the reduction gear. And on the diesel, the ship could do about 6 knots in a dead flat calm. Its claim to fame comes in during the hurricane in '64, which I think we'll get to later when you ask notable events in the ship's career. But by and large, it is if you think about if any of your audience attended Mass Maritime from 85 to 97 and sailed on Patriot State, the original Patriot State, which was formerly the Grace Line Santa Mercedes, it's about the same plant. It's because it's a passenger cargo ship. It's got, of course, that ship was also a refrigerated cargo ship, so it had a larger refrigeration plant. So the difference then is the nuclear power plant, right? We didn't have boilers. There was a small um, import boiler for aux steam, but by and large, once the Atomic Energy Commission permitted the plant to operate in port, then they would leave the reactor operating sometimes. There were times when it shut down. It's not absolutely brand new technology because it's several years after Nautilus and it's Nautilus's proof of concept and the theories of reactor design even predate Nautilus, which is one of the reasons why Nautilus was able to be built as quickly as it could be. This was a commercial design from the ground up. Eisenhower's original thought was take a submarine reactor, put it in a hull that's already being built, and get a ship out to sea. And in order to meet the political objectives of demonstrating civilian use and commercial properties, that approach was not adopted, right? So the plant was designed, it was designed very conservatively. If you think about it, Savannah was authorized within a week in 1956 of the Andrea Doria Stockholm collision. So naval architectural factors were such that you wanted to protect the ship from that type of collision at sea. Theoretically, Andrea Doria should not have sunk, but it did. And everybody can debate the missing watertight door or the open watertight door and whatever else you want to, but arguably the ship shouldn't have sunk. And so foremost in the minds of the designers of the ship is to make it the safest ship afloat, to avoid that type of accident, to avoid the prospect of releasing into the environment nuclear material, right? And similarly, the reactor operators are designing as safe a plant as they can, so that in the event of a maximum credible accident, it's not going to be a China syndrome, release everything up, gigantic plumes in the air and things like that. If the plant melted down, would the core melt through the bottom of the ship and into the ocean? Possibly, but then you have the ultimate heat sink, they like to say, right? So the plant was designed for high degrees of ship motion. It was designed to be very redundant. It has two primary coolant loops. So it's got a port steam generator, starboard steam generator. You can operate on one loop or the other or both, depending on what you wanted to do. It's a pressurized water reactor of very simple and rugged design. Today, nothing state of the art today, nothing classified back then. The need to share the technical information with the countries that would host the ship meant that you couldn't classify the information. The desire to showcase the civilian nature of it meant that you couldn't classify the information. So even to this day, it's not subject to export controls. And we have gone back to the Department of Energy every once in a while to verify that. And there's much that you can find on the public domain. Arguably, you could find enough drawings in the public domain to build the plant if you wanted to. I don't know that anybody would want to, but you could. So in most other respects, the ship is state of the normal, I like to call it. It's not state of the art because of that funding shortfall, because of the appropriations shortfall in constructing the ship. A lot of things that might have been state of the art or even advancing the state of the art that might have been contemplated for the ship could not be fitted because there was not enough money to do that. The only feature that was fitted to the ship that might fit that definition is the fin stabilizers. And those were provided for creature comfort. They were relatively new on ships. Not absolutely new, but they were relatively new, particularly in the United States. So it was a distinctive feature that the ship would be fitted with fin stabilizers. But it was not necessary for reactor operation. It was purely for creature comfort. Ironically enough, they tended to malfunction more so than function correctly. There was something was hooked up backwards, and half the time they would rig out the stabilizers, and it would either exacerbate or induce a roll rather than counteract it. And so there's a very famous corroborated incident off the Virginia Capes on a demo run where the stabilizers were deployed, put the ship in a snap roll, the water sloshed out of the pool and took several handbags over the side from the spouses of the dignitaries that were on board. And the chief engineer was summarily hauled to the bridge for chewing out by the Commodore. And Gaston de Groot was not known to be a civil person outside of his interface with the passengers. So, that was Jim Morrissey, I think, felt it that day.
Can you talk for a minute about the citadel that the reactor was contained within? That it only had 2 access points, and it was meant to protect it in case of a collision.
Yeah, so it's a containment vessel that, for ease of comparison, it's roughly the diameter of an Ohio class ballistic missile submarine. How do we know this? Well, because there was a point in time when the Office of Management and Budget, when they were evaluating MARAD coming out of the blue with a nuclear power plant and decommissioning, said, go talk to the Navy. The Navy should do this for you. And our friends at the Navy were very kind. They didn't want to do it, so they put together a proposal for OMB that explained why they couldn't do it, rather than a proposal that said how they could. And we appreciate that very, very much. But it basically began with, this thing is too big to get on the crawler to get up off of the barge to get into the trench at Hanford. So it's just too big, But the containment vessel is 35 feet in diameter. It's got a cylindrical section in the center and then 2 hemispherical ends. It varies in thickness from about 2 inches thick to about 3.5 inches thick. It's got large stiffening rings. It was designed to contain a complete loss of coolant accident. So, you have an immediate flashing of all the primary coolant in the steam, and the containment vessel won't rupture. It has the control rod drives are driven from the top down. And so the CRD structure extends above the reactor. So there's a cupola section above the cylinder. with a bolted head that has 168 bolts in it. We removed all 168 to get it off. So, we didn't have to count. We had the drawing, but I think we didn't miss any. And it had two accesses in the top built in. One was a 42-inch diameter plug that was for equipment, and that was in the forward hemisphere. And the same 42-inch diameter plug in the aft hemisphere had a 26-inch diameter airlock fitted inside it. And that was the means of personnel entrance and exit. Shielding began with an annular water shield tank. So the neutron shield tank for neutron streaming radiation was an annular water tank that surrounded the reactor itself and was 33 inches deep, surrounded on the outside by lead shielding, elemental lead from 2 inches to 4 inches, depending on where it was in relationship to the core. The upper hemisphere of the containment vessel was shielded with lead and polyethylene as radiation shielding. The lower hemisphere was not shielded, but instead there was concrete, which is often used as a biological shield. And so concrete surrounded the reactor compartment. So the containment vessel sits on center line of the ship at midships, or just 12 inches off of midships. And, that compartment inside the vessel, it's 17 feet inboard of the shell, is the beginning of the reactor compartment. And that's where you start with the concrete, which extends from the tank top all the way up to the sea deck level. So about 3 full decks up. And that concrete varied in thickness from 4 feet down to 2 feet. Port and starboard between C deck, D deck, and the 14-foot flat, which is then above the tank top, there was a collision boundary that was basically a crush zone, a crumple zone, if you will. And it was 25 inches deep, 1-inch steel, 3-inch redwood in alternating layers, backed by 2 feet of concrete. Below it is 4 feet of concrete. Above it is none. And we, in designing the decommissioning project, the dismantlement of the nuclear power plant, sought to build a horizontal entrance into the containment vessel, because as you can imagine, even opening up the 42-inch equipment hatch and putting a ladder in that, it's a vertical ladder that extends a full deck. You've got an airlock on the other side. And if you had any kind of an industrial accident inside the CV with workers in there, it would be difficult to extricate them. So we wanted a way for people to be able to walk in, walk out, and do so with few constraints. So we built a large 6x6 access in 2018 to cut through that entire collision boundary at the D deck level to get into the CV in the area where primary coolant pumps once stood, and had an open area inside the forward hemisphere of the CV. And in doing so, we exposed that entire cross section, which if you took the engineering tour, you would have seen.
I did, and I remember, and I took photos of it at that time. And I think they said at that time that it was a relatively new feature. So, yeah.
It was certainly nothing that you ever saw when the ship was in service or when it was a museum. So that's the containment. Now it's very large. It's very heavy. It's not economical in the sense that it takes up too much weight, too much space. The Savannah program was not just the ship itself and its operation. It was an entire research and development program by the Maritime Administration and the Atomic Energy Commission to develop second and third generation nuclear ships and nuclear power plants. So under the auspices of that R&D program, there were about 3 different second generation nuclear power plants that were designed and built, one of which, the consolidated nuclear steam generator by Babcock and Wilcox, was used for Otto Hahn, the West German ship. And Otto Hahn was only about 4 years behind Savannah. So that plant was built by West Germany's B&W subsidiary under license. And it was a more compact power plant. The ship had lower horsepower, so it was a bit smaller to begin with, but it was a much more efficient, much more compact nuclear power plant, and certainly would have been the type of plant that would have been used in second and third generation ships had they been built in the United States. General Electric had a competing design, as did Aerojet, I think, at the time. And so Otto Hahn also used a more resilient form of collision protection that relied less on concrete and more on the yield strengths and the yield properties of steel to allow for the same effect. And it, in a sense, that was a designed lessons learned out of Savannah, because Savannah, the plant is at midships. It's this very stiff box in the middle of a flexible hull girder. And I alluded earlier that the ship sailed through a hurricane in September of '64. And she survived that, obviously, but she also did buckle at the connection, basically the stiff connection between the flexing forward end of the ship, the reactor compartment, and the aft end of the ship. So it had to be heavily reinforced with deep longitudinals. And so that particular aspect of the ship's design, of the hull design, is something you would want to avoid going forward.
How did the crew train to operate the nuclear powered plant?
Well, the first crew, so again, the premise is we're going to train existing merchant mariners to do this, right? And the first crew, of course, Savannah was not yet built. Later, it served as its own prototype. Okay, it served as its own training facility for at-sea hands-on training. But in the absence of that, in 1957, 58, 59, there was cooperation with the Navy. The first two crews did get opportunities to go out to the Nautilus prototype out in Idaho, and also had some demonstration runs on submarines. But that was the extent of naval involvement in the Savannah program. In parallel, MARAD contracted for a training program to be established. Initially, it was at Lynchburg College. That was for the academic training of the crews. A permanent academic center was eventually established at the U.S. Merchant Marine Academy at Kings Point. Remarkably, that institution was selected. The fact that it was owned and operated by the Maritime Administration probably had little to do with the selection, or maybe it had everything to do with the selection. But the training facility was eventually established at Kings Point. It had a full mission simulator up there, analog computer driven. They could do any scenario that they wanted to do. The selectees would have a 6-month academic training regimen, 6 to 12 months, and then they would go to the ship for 6 months, at the end of which they would sit for their Atomic Energy Commission license. And so, there are 2 licenses that the AEC or that the NRC today will grant: a reactor operator license and a senior reactor operator license. Every watch on Savannah, you had an SRO and an RO, and then you had a third engineer managing the conventional aspects of the powertrain. So you had a minimum of 3 engineers on watch. And all of them had Coast Guard credentials. Virtually all of them had Coast Guard credentials higher than the rating that they were sailing, unless, of course, they were chief engineer, right? So most of the first assistant engineers, most of the second engineers had chief engineer licenses, okay? And so even the thirds had seconds licenses. And the same was true on the deck side. Now, the deck officers went through similar academic training. Remember that, the gist of that argument between the engineers and the deck officers, yes, the engineer officers are responsible for the literal operation of the reactor, but the deck officers are responsible for that reactor on the ship as the ship as a whole, facing the hazards of the sea, right? And so the argument, I think, can be made, and must have successfully been made before the arbitration, that the deck officers bore ultimate responsibility for anything that the engineers were doing, even though they didn't hold an AEC license. And that's an interesting conundrum when you look at the landside plant analogs, because you'll have a licensed senior reactor operator holding the position of chief nuclear officer at a commercial power plant, whereas at the ship at sea you have the master. The master will not have a license, and the master will not have the training that the licensees have. Yet the master has to have the ultimate authority for the ship. And when you look back at the licensing history of Savannah and the organizational history of the operating staff, you see that distinction and the authorities that are granted to the master that the AEC didn't necessarily grant to a landside analog. So the training was extensive, but these were people that applied for the program, were carefully screened and selected. They all exhibited academic excellence. There were a handful of Hawes Pipers that came through the program. Most of them, however, were federal or state academy graduates or school ship graduates before depending on when they graduated from the programs. You know, they all were pretty well primed for success. I'm not aware that there was a significant dropout rate or loss rate in the training program. And then again, you know, they came to the ship, they sailed for 6 months on the ship before they sat for their licenses.
I think I remember reading sometime that the simulation where the simulator was put on board Savannah, that it was in one of the cargo holds. Am I remembering that correctly?
To my knowledge, no. The simulator was installed at Kings Point, and it remained on Kings Point well after the training program ended, right? So Savannah came out of service in 1970, so the training program that was in progress at that time was canceled, and the next class was canceled, right? Eventually, the simulator, they kept one of the mimic boards on display of the campus, and the remaining sections of it were transferred to a Marriott warehouse in Kearney, New Jersey, that also housed fleet spares. We had Victory Ship and Liberty Ship spare parts in this warehouse in Kearney, New Jersey, that was started as a Maritime Commission warehouse, one of many that were around the country. And when that closed in the early 80s, the Victory Ship spares were barged down to James River and placed on board Catawba Victory. There's no record that the simulator portions went with it, so they might have been abandoned in place. We really don't know. We don't know where the simulator wound up, or if it was scrapped, or whatever happened to it, and we don't know the disposition of the mimic board that was at the academy. Now, what Savannah did carry were for import demonstrations. It had a series of, I think, about 7 automated display panels that would be put out in each port. So, you know, you would have a couple thousand people waiting in line to visit the ship. And so these panels would be put out along the waiting line so that people would have something to see as they advanced. In one of the storms at sea, those broke loose and got trashed, and so they were not replaced.
I want to know how many visitors hit the scram button on the display board.
On that Saturday or any other time?
Any other time?
I don't know. I mean, I don't know whether there was one on those or not, but I'm sure that if they had the opportunity, people will always touch a button.
Yeah, for sure.
Always touch a button.
You alluded to this a little bit earlier, so I'm interested in the answer. Was the plant ever shut down during her operational days? It sounded like earlier you said that she was shut down a couple of times.
Well, there were a handful of scrams. I mean, scrams could happen intentionally, or they could happen inadvertently. The most famous of the inadvertent scrams is the hurricane in 1964. Stan Wheatley, who was chief engineer, was a brilliant guy, class of 47 at Kings Point, one of those people that lived and breathed the ship. You know, he knew what was going on. It was in his bones. He could feel it before the watch could report to him that there was a problem. He was on his way to the engine room because he felt it, right? And so the ship was returning to New York from its second transatlantic voyage, and they had a report of a hurricane in the path. And the captain, Dave McMichael, consulted with the chief. What do you think we should do? And Stan gave what he admitted for decades was the worst advice he ever gave a master. He says, well, nuclear ships are going to have to face the hazards of the sea. We should just go through and see what happens. And so they did. And there was a tertiary fault. It was not ship motion. It was simply the motions may have dislodged a little piece of something that caused a high differential pressure in the control rod drive. Hydraulic strainers, and triggered a scram. So here they are in the middle of the hurricane, and there goes the reactor. And very much similar to El Faro, if you think about it. You know, the ship loses power in the middle of the hurricane. Of course, they had the advantage that El Faro did not of the auxiliary propulsion motor. So the diesels kick in, they get the motor on, and they could at least keep steerage, right? And that guy who hired me, Joe Seelinger, was on board. He was not on watch at the time, and he wound up going to the top of the house and trying to hold on with one hand and take pictures with the other. And then he misplaced the slides. So, but he said it was a harrowing thing, and of course the passengers were all gathered up in the veranda trying to hold on. They never could have launched the boats. So, but they managed to maintain steerage. And Stan basically invented the fast restart. It was not something that was allowed by procedure. It wasn't something that was defined by procedure, but it was because he had this intuitive sense of engineering, and he was brilliant. I mean, he performed academically quite well, and so he had this immediate sense that if I do this, I can get out of this problem. And so they got the reactor up in 90 minutes instead of 4 hours and
Wow.
steamed the ship to safety. And, when I have the opportunity to tell this story on guided tours, I use it as an example that maybe the engineers were right about what they were thinking with respect to the differential rates of pay, because the master would not have been able to do that, right?
Yeah,
So
indeed.
Stan saved the ship. Of course, Stan also caused the ship to be an extremist in a way. Although the master does bear responsibility for that. Ultimately, it was his decision to go through. And so everybody was feting Stan. They were buying him drinks, and it was it was slaps on the back, and everything is great. And then he got a telegram from the Atomic Energy Commission that said, "Hey Stan, thanks for saving the ship. We'd like to have a chat. Would you please pack up your logbooks and come see us in Germantown, Maryland after the ship gets in?" So he went down there, had an interview or two. There was a hearing, and at the end of which they said, "Stan, thank you for saving the ship. It was a great thing to do. It would have been tragic if you had not. However, you violated all the procedures, and we can't allow that. So please surrender your license, your senior reactor operator license." He didn't lose his Coast Guard license, but he lost his SRO license. And I always challenge the visitors. I said, "What did the government do to Stan after he lost his license?" And the answer is, gave him a job for life. He went to work for Merit and retired a couple of years before I joined, but I got to know him later. So it was a great privilege. So, so that's, by and large, the way that the operators described the plant is that it was extremely reliable. It was always ready when it needed to be ready. It was never not ready when it needed to be ready. It was highly responsive to changes in load. Extremely maneuverable, much more responsive than the fossil fueled plants. A regular oil fired boiler had too much lag one way or the other. The reactor could respond to changes in load almost instantaneously. And the challenge that the reactor operators had in doing so was to not pop the safeties on the pressurizer. If they popped the safeties on the pressurizer, they owed the watch a case of JD. If the heaters had to come on, they owed a case of beer. But if they popped the safeties, they owed a case of JD, which was not on the license exam, by the way. But it was the '60s, so the booze was on the ship. So they all described it as the best engineered ship, the best engineering plant that they ever ran.
Was Savannah ever refueled?
Yeah. There was already discussion that the ship was so successful, it had satisfied its goals and objectives to the extent that it could, which was greater than had been anticipated by the mid '60s. Right. So, the government has spent quite a bit of money to build something that is proving to be very successful, yet isn't necessarily going to lead to second generation ships, because there are circumstances in U.S. shipbuilding and U.S. ship operations in the '60s and into the '70s and early '80s that are beyond the scope of Savannah to solve, right? And principally, it's the differential cost, the higher cost of U.S. flag construction and operations relative to foreign ships that have resulted in the subsidy programs under the Merchant Marine Act of '36 and then later expanded in the Merchant Marine Act of 1970. And, nuclear ships cost a premium to build. Nobody quite yet understood that they also cost a premium to get rid of, that decommissioning as a controlled industrial dismantlement of a nuclear power plant is a significant percentage of original cost of construction. You're not going to take a load of grain to the Far East and drive the ship up on the beach in India and scrap it. That's not going to happen. You're going to spend lots of money to dismantle a nuclear power plant, but nobody understood that yet. So that was beyond one of the things that's beyond the scope of Savannah to discover, because we hadn't even discovered that with the Manhattan Project facilities yet. But the ship costs a premium to build, it costs a premium to operate, because even though the nuclear fuel is less expensive than oil, even before the oil crisis, all right, the number of operators, remember, I'm saying you've got a crew of 65, you've got 3 licensed engineers on watch on every watch, you bring in a 4th when you're maneuvering or going, or at other times. And so you're heavily skewed with highly paid engineering officers they're expensive, and when you look at the operating costs of merchant ships, fuel is not always the most expensive part of it. People is a very expensive part of the operating cost of a ship. And here you have a ship that skews heavily on people. And yeah, there are economic advantages that you gain elsewhere. You can on a given displacement, you can carry more cargo because you're not carrying fuel that you're consuming. So you can get more revenue from more cargo. You can get more turnaround time because you don't have the refueling time that you have to deal with bunkering time. Okay. And so there are ways where you can be less expensive than the fossil fueled competitor. But there are also ways where you're more expensive, and you've got capital cost and the crew. And the government is not going to pay a premium for that if there's not a foreign competitor to calculate a subsidy against. And nobody wants to pay the premium simply for some theoretical advantage. So second generation ships, although there were companies that wanted to build them, were not going to be built because nobody could finance them. And Savannah couldn't solve that problem. There's absolutely nothing that Savannah could do to solve shipping economics. So by the mid-60s, there's already talk of ending the program. A lot of people who were supporters of the program argued against that and said, hey, guys, we have too much invested. It's been out for too short a time. You've got to keep it going. So when looking at the options for refueling, in 67, there were several different alternatives, from a full complete replacement core to what was called a core shuffle, which was simply replacing the 4 center elements and moving the other 28 around so that the flux profile would be a little bit different and improve reactivity and let you exploit more of the energy already present in the existing fuel. And that was the option that was taken, was the core shuffle. The first core was projected to give a range of about 300,000 nautical miles, which is about what it did. With the reshuffled core, it could go, roughly another 200,000 or so. It sailed 170,000 more before the program terminated in 1970. So it had enough reactivity left to make either that voyage to Japan or perhaps a voyage to South America. In either case, there was a second core that was available. The ship could have been refueled another time. And there was a proposal or two to put the ship into other service. Remarkably, the Panama Canal Steamship Company came to Merritt in 1969 with a proposal to charter the ship, to take over the license, to take over the ship entirely, to replace the trio of the Ancon, Cristobal, and Panama, the small C3s, passenger cargo ships that they were running. They wanted to charter it for 5 years, and they had more money than God, because they were supported by the canal. So they were going to refuel it. They were going to expand it to 100 passengers. They were going to put heavy lift gear on it. They were going to run it for 5 years. I have no idea from the paperwork why Marriott said no. But that certainly was probably the most realistic of any of the alternatives to keep the ship in service. There was, as with many Mariner class ships of the time, a proposal to convert it to a container ship. If that had been done, it would have demonstrated the different economic profile, but it would have done nothing to change the dynamics of operating the plant. There were a lot of studies in place to try to reduce the manning scale, and they might have gotten it down to 60 or 55, but that still would have been 20 more than a comparable conventional ship. And then there was a proposal to convert it into an oceanographic research ship for the International Year of the Ocean in 1974. We've got a model of that on board the ship. And that was a pretty interesting proposal, and probably, again, a realistic use of the hull, but an expensive use of the hull. And so none of those came to pass. So the core shuffle was the least expensive of the options to refuel the ship, as ultimately was the mothballing in the mid-1970s, the least expensive of the decommissioning alternatives once people started to figure out what those might be.
Erhard, are there any other major events in the ship's operational history that you want to mention?
Well, we talked about the hurricane. I think, interestingly enough, Savannah was visited by a number of heads of state and 5 different kings, royalty over the years that had voyaged. But it made a voyage to Germany, to West Germany in 1964, and Otto Hahn himself, Otto Hahn and Lisa Meissner were the 2 that were credited with discovering fission. And Otto Hahn, for whom the West German merchant ship was named, visited Savannah and got to tour down in the control room. We have a nice big picture of him and Stan Wheatley and Admiral Will, the chairman of American Exporters Branson. The unfortunate aspect of the engineers' refusal to sail the ship in '63 was that the ship was to depart from its servicing facility in Galveston, Texas, make a brief port call in Houston, and then travel to Baltimore, where it would host National Maritime Day in 1963, which was to be officiated by some, government flunky named John Kennedy. And of course, the following year, that was not an option. And the following year, when it did come to Baltimore, the president was nowhere in sight because the stigma of the work stoppage had clouded the ship's cachet, if you will, in government circles. Not its popularity with the public, but certainly in government circles, it transformed into a white elephant. We had a long association with Helen Delich Bentley, who your readers, your listeners may know, was a fierce champion for the U.S. Maritime industries, for the Navy, for the Merchant Marine, for ports, and domestic and international trade. She covered the ship as Helen Delich, as the maritime reporter for the Baltimore Sun when the keel was laid. The following year, when it was launched, her byline had changed to Helen Delich Bentley because she had married Bill. And she stayed with the ship, watching over the ship as a reporter for the Sun until she was named the chair of the Federal Maritime Commission in 1969. When the ship came here to Baltimore in 2008, it was just kind of a fluke in a way. It was the least expensive of the 4 lay berths proposals that we received, ranging anywhere from North Philly down to Norfolk. And the fact that it cut my commute in half was a bonus. But it had little to do with why we selected it. It was really about money. But you have to clear these things with members of Congress. And although Helen was out of office by that point, she was still a force in the port. So immediately after we announced the lay berth contract, she's on the phone. Somehow she got my phone number, and she called me up to find out what the skinny was. And then she came to visit National Maritime Day. We had an invitational event in 2008, a crew reunion. We had a heavy wind event that blew the ship basically off the pier to the point where it almost dragged the gangway off of the temporary stair tower we had up. Helen had arrived. She just marched right up the accommodation ladder as a force of nature. And so, we enjoyed our relationship with her until she passed in 2016. And we're proud that one of her last public events was actually an Eagle Scout Court of Honor on board Savannah. So we've had passing claims with fame, with people that near and dear to us and important to the industries. Glenn Seaborg, discoverer of plutonium, part of the Manhattan Project, chairman of the Atomic Energy Commission for so long, was a very instrumental part of the program and a proponent of nuclear merchant ships during his tenure at the AEC, and sailed on Savannah for a couple of voyage segments. So, again, all pretty cool. And of course, our association with Eisenhower, we deeply appreciate. And we've adopted the motto that they have at the farm and at the memorial in DC and out at the homestead in Abilene and the museum and the library. We still like Ike. So
We still like Ike, indeed. When I opened, I talked about seeing Savannah on the James River. You talked about her being at Patriots Point. Will you share with the Talk a Little, Learn a Lot audience all that has happened to Savannah since her steaming days?
oh my goodness. In 1970, so the city of Savannah, Georgia, as early as 1969, when there were rumors that the ship would come out of service, had written to the Nixon administration and suggested that they would like to obtain the ship as a museum, as a memorial to President Eisenhower, if the ship came out of service. And Nixon, of course, was in favor of this. He was very close to Eisenhower. His eulogy is quite elegant. And the families became woven together through marriage. So Nixon was in favor of gifting the ship to the city of Savannah. And in fact, that was done in 1972, in January of 72, after the fuel was taken out. And the problem was nobody yet knew. Now you face this issue of what is decommissioning? What do you do with a nuclear power plant after it permanently shuts down? And even though Manhattan Project plants were being removed from service only around the same time, nobody really knew what do you do with them. There were no regulations. There was no best practice. There was, oh my God. So, the prevailing thought was, well, we'll mothball it, basically. We'll make it inactive and we'll seal it up and we'll let it sit for 50 years and then we'll figure out what to do. So that's what people started to do. And it quickly became apparent on land that didn't work. About 20 years later, when some workers on the roof of the K-25 uranium separation facility in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, fell through the deteriorated roof, it was like, oh my God, the building is falling apart around us. We can't keep doing this. So decommissioning over the decades from the mid-70s to the mid-90s morphed into this very performance-based program, an active program, not an inactive program. You can still go into protective storage, but it's not the old mothballing scenario of taking out the fuel, remove the water, disconnect the electrical and mechanical connections, and lock and seal the door and come back every 3 months and check the lock and the seal. You're in there, you're actively monitoring and maintaining and ensuring that the plant doesn't degrade and that the systems that you might need for decommissioning are available when you eventually decommission. You do have a period of 60 years under NRC rules from permanent cessation of operations to terminate the license. And Savannah's used about 45 of those, as it turns out. What our thought, was, okay, we'll try to make it a memorial to President Eisenhower in Savannah. That was irreconcilable with NRC regulations, and the only mechanism that Marriott understood at the time was to transfer title to the state, because that's what the AEC had done to Marriott. Remember, the AEC built the power plant. They vested title and future liability in Marriott. So we tried to do the same to the state of Georgia if they wanted it. And Governor Carter thought that was a bad idea. Now, let's remember that Governor Carter was not anti-nuke, and Governor Carter was responsible for the preservation of Nautilus. So it's not like he was anti-Savannah, but he was anti-raw deal for the state of Georgia. So, he saw that leave. Now, by that time, Patriots Point was being established, and Senator Thurmond and Senator Hollings and some of the congressional staff were interested in acquiring Savannah to join Yorktown at Patriots Point. They were successful in doing that, but to do so, they had to pass legislation to authorize a charter rather than a donation. There had to be an EIS, an environmental impact statement, for managing the license and allowing unrestricted visitation to a licensed nuclear power plant. And the deal was different, as we said before, because Marriott owned the ship and was responsible for underwater hull maintenance, and the museum was not. So the ship went there. It didn't succeed at Patriots Point because Patriots Point didn't have the resources to put into it. There were difficulties in the administration of the museum. There were failed real estate developments that were intended to provide a revenue stream to the museum. And then they had Hurricane Hugo in '89 that really knocked all the ships for a loop, including Savannah, quite a bit of interior damage at the time. And so that was really the reason why they returned the ship to Merritt. That's when we took it out in '94, put it through dry docking, and then laid it up in James River, and with the full intention of carrying out the 50-year program of protected storage, of mothballed protective storage, because it's 1994, and the new regs haven't even been published yet. So we all figured we would retire, and we were wrong, because by 2000 we had found ourselves in a little bit of trouble with the license. MARAD, as you might imagine, is organically a maritime organization, right? We have expertise and proficiency in things maritime, not in things nuclear. And NRC recognized that when we took the ship back in '94, and they said, we trust that, we know that you can take care of the ship, which really was wishful thinking. And we trust that you'll bring in proper people to do nuclear stuff when you need that, which was also wishful thinking, as it turned out. And so by 2000, we had run afoul of some small administrative specifications in the license related to emergency response and health physics on call. And we didn't know enough to cure those things or to amend them out of the license. We really didn't need them. They were holdovers from the museum experience. We didn't need them. We could have amended the license to take those out. But we didn't do that in a timely fashion. And of course, once we got the violation the following year, we had to comply with what was there. You couldn't cure the violation by removing the underlying cause. You had to meet the underlying cause. And so this was the beginning of our education in what it meant to be a contemporary proficient nuclear licensee. It was the wake-up call. And then 9/11 happened, and all the agencies were told to look at their potential vulnerabilities and what do you do to address them. And that's the proximate reason why in early 2002, Administrator Schubert made the decision to decommission. It's not what we recommended to him. We recommended some other steps to protect the facility, but decommissioning was far and away the most efficient way to deal with it. And so that began our sojourn to become a contemporary nuclear licensee. And that's really what we have become, because in this modern scheme of decommissioning protective storage, it's operations-based philosophy. You take your operating license and you scale it down to suit the reduced scope and effect of not having fuel in the reactor. Maybe the fuel is all out in the spent storage pad. And so your radiological risks are reduced. So you reduce the scope and effect of things like your radiation protection program, but it doesn't go away. Neither does your maintenance program, neither do your administrative programs. They just scale back. And the interesting thing about when things scale back is that they can also go the other way. They can scale up again, right? They can be increased in scope and effect to suit an operating plan. For us, what we had to do is create a program from scratch, which we basically did after we brought the ship here to Baltimore in 2008. She comes out of the fleet in 2006. It really is a floating derelict by that point. It's had tremendous interior damage, but it's also going to be the host site of the work. And so we needed to clean it because we needed to work on it. So we towed it over to Kiwanis Shipyard. We did topside repairs to seal the water ingress from the outside. We cleaned the interior of all the rot and the mold and the mildew and got it functionally, occupationally safe. Took it to a lay berth over at Newport News, where ironically we were kicked out by the city because we were a nuclear threat, as we're looking over at the Eisenhower sitting in the pier at the shipyard. And then we went to Shipco for dry docking, and we lay there over the summer of 2007, docked in the early part of 2008, all of which was intended to basically get the ship ready to go and support the decommissioning project. Decommissioning is this end of the life cycle of a nuclear power plant, and on land, you have land, right? So decommissioning contractors who are highly skilled and proficient, they come, they mobilize to the site, they use the available property for the temporary services and infrastructure that they need to dismantle the plant. Sometimes they can repurpose existing buildings, but more often they build temporary buildings. A Butler building goes up for waste material handling and so forth, and everything else goes down to ground level. The waste streams are segregated and they're sent out. You have place for cranes, you have place for trucks, you have place for parking. You bring in office trailers. And all of that is done within the licensed site footprint because the licensed site is defined by the outer perimeter of the property. Well, for Savannah, the outer property limit is the hull of the ship. Right. And when you're in the NRC environment, when you go off site, when you go outside the property line, now you have all the other jurisdictions that come into play. So it behooves you to stay within the property boundary. And on a landside plant, you've got plenty of space to do that. On a ship, you don't. Right? You have just the interior volume of the ship because the minute you go off the ship, you're off site and everything else triggers in. There's no commercial shipyard in the United States that does nuclear. I mean, you know, technically, yes, Newport News and Electric Boat are commercial yards, but they're really controlled by Navy, right? You know, and so Newport News in particular is sort of prohibited on doing commercial nuclear stuff. So you know, we didn't really have an option to take Savannah to a commercial shipyard to do decommissioning, particularly because commercial shipyards, they like to capture you and make you subject to their rules. And they really don't like it when you hire independent subcontractors to work on their site on a ship that's captive to their rules. And that's not the way the NRC works, right? NRC, the use of nuclear material and technology in the United States is reserved to the federal government, and it's licensed through the NRC for everybody but for DOD and DOE. And even there are certain applications in DOD and DOE space that are NRC licensed. And so it's a very controlled environment, and you have to play by their rules, not by the shipyard's rules. So we knew we couldn't go to a shipyard. We had great success at Kiwanis and at North Shipco in adapting what were our access control requirements and so forth to the shipyard environment, but it meant training every worker who set foot on the ship or in the dock floor. We had less success with that up in Philadelphia when we dried up there in 2019. And I think that had much to do with the differing points of view of the management of the different facilities. But we knew that we had enough interior volume that we could adapt it for the needs of the decommissioning project, improve the ship in the process, set it on a course towards future preservation, and do so efficiently and effectively, and keep the offsite footprint just to a pier where we would park and have a crane, and have trucks to land the loaded intermodal containers onto. And we were successful in doing that here in Baltimore. We didn't come here to do that, but we found that this was a good place to do it. And we ultimately stayed here. But, you know, we started building a program, an administrative program, and shortly after 2008 when we came up here. And ultimately, in going through and trying to reconcile what does a ship need, what does a nuclear power plant need, it became evident to us that you really can only have one administrative program that governs the totality of a ship. You cannot have two bifurcated programs and pretend like the interfaces are clean. They always overlap. There's always gray area. There's always the problem of the deck officer is master of the vessel as a whole, and the nuclear engineers have the piece of it, right? There is no clean interface. And so you can only have one program. And when you only have one program, it's got to be the nuclear program, because the nuclear program will cover everything you ever need for the maritime program, but the maritime program does not cover everything you need for the nuclear program. And the only place we found where there was a formal maritime program with no direct nuclear analog was the safety management system under the International Safety Management Code. And there, that program that we built for Savannah began with a maritime basis and blended nuclear into it. Every other thing in our program is nuclear that blends maritime in. And we found that it's worked quite well. And for us, we believe it's a prototype in a sense that can be expanded to future generations of nuclear merchant ships that will go to sea, because there's tremendous interest across the board throughout all aspects of commercial industry, commercial maritime industry, to build nuclear merchant ships as a means to reduce air emissions and to meet the IMO's very lofty goal of near zero or zero emissions by 2050, which requires near zero or zero emissions ships to start being built by 2030 to hit the fleet replacement by 2050. So it's a massive challenge. And so we do think that Savannah has something to offer in the future based on what we've been doing today.
That is really interesting. That may be the most important part of her legacy. That's so curious. Well, Erhard, I consider Savannah to be a national treasure. But what's going to happen to her now? Like, uh, tell us about what is the future for the nuclear ship Savannah?
Well, fortunately, the keeper of the National Register of Historic Places agrees with your assessment, and of course, ship was upgraded and designated as a National Historic Landmark in 1991, and so the NHL status actually conveys the highest standards of protection to any historic object under federal law. And particularly for federally owned National Historic Landmarks, the agencies are required, the use of the word shall, not may, shall minimize harm to the landmark in all of the planning and actions that they undertake. And how we interpret that is basically uh, no federal owner of a landmark should destroy it if there's any reasonable alternative to destruction. And that's the key thing that Marriott senior management has accepted, right? That we set a very aspirational goal in 2005 that at the end of decommissioning, we wanted to see the ship preserved. We knew it. We knew it was not going to be by Marriott. All right. We don't have a mission to operate a museum ship. We don't have appropriations to operate a museum ship. So Marriott by itself is not going to be the operator of a preserved Savannah, but we do have the authority to convey the ship either through donation or charter. And so what we're seeking is that reasonable alternative, the partner to whom we can convey the ship, the entity to whom we can convey the ship for preservation in the future. And the fact that we have made such dramatic improvements to the ship's infrastructure and to the ship's interior volume for decommissioning purposes, while keeping in mind the Historic Preservation Act requirements and keeping a preservation conscious focus on that. So we did the details right, meaning that where we built out new facilities inside the ship, the color of the paint matches the color of the paint elsewhere in the ship. The architectural details like the switch plates and the switches and things like that match the details elsewhere, so that the fit, the finish resemble other parts of the ship. So it doesn't look like this is something glaringly different, that it belongs there, that it fits the theme of the overall ship. All of this stuff was done in a way that the infrastructure is built out to provide occupational safety for the many decommissioning workers that were on board. We have fire-rated stair towers that provide access, vertical access through the cargo holds, fire and smoke detection throughout, general alarm systems that were expanded, life safety systems, access and egress arrangements that allow you to get people off the ship from the weather. All of that combined with the ship's original public features that showcase that it's designed for visitors in port, make it essentially a ship that is a turnkey proposition for static use. We don't necessarily say museum because that's only one of many possible uses that you could put the ship to. And Savannah is both large enough and small enough that it could serve a multitude of uses at the same time. You could have educational components concurrent with museums, with conference centers, with offices, there are any number of ways that you could use the ship. One thing I say it probably will not be as a hotel, even a boutique hotel, because the rooms are simply, we haven't restored running water everywhere in the ship. With a very limited amount of running water. And, the rooms are simply not quite up to par for a boutique hotel. But there are a few people that might want that experience, but not enough to make it a going concern, probably. But there's a lot of different things you can use it for. So it's kind of like the Goldilocks of ships. It's not as big as a battleship or an aircraft carrier, and as attractive as those are, and I've been on all the battleships except Missouri. They are fascinating. I mean, I was on North Carolina a few months ago, and I was on there for the better part of 3.5 hours, and that was after spending an hour talking to Jay Martin, the executive director. But it is, in terms of being able to put it to use to produce revenue, it's very limiting. The aircraft carrier has more available space because it's got the hangar deck that can be purposed and the flight deck to an extent as well. But these are big ships that require significant maintenance. It's a lot of surface to paint, which Savannah doesn't quite have nearly as much of, and it's much simpler. And frankly, we've removed a fair amount of top hamper just to make it simpler. So, and by contrast, it's also not as small as a destroyer or a destroyer escort or a Coast Guard cutter. And so it's got volume that it can use and attractive public spaces. So we do think between the turnkey condition, MARAD's affirmative obligation to seek its preservation, and and the attractiveness of the ship as by itself is that it's got good prospects to be preserved. If there is any ship on this earth that had a better chance of being preserved than Savannah, I don't know what it is. It doesn't guarantee it will be, right? And I will freely admit, and I have freely admitted to many people, that my objective is to be able to sleep at night no matter what the outcome is. Because I don't control, and the agency doesn't ultimately control what the outcome is. It requires somebody from outside to be willing to take the ship on. If we charter the ship, if we lease it, there are opportunities for Marriott to continue to support it. If we donate it, those are more limited. But I don't think that we're walking away from it because it has always been our ship. Unlike United States, which we built, but then conveyed to U.S. lines, and our interest in the ship ended in the 1980s. Savannah Marriott continues to own Savannah. We've owned it from day one. And so whatever this disposition outcome will be, preservation, we hope, Marriott's intimately involved in that. So we're very hopeful. We have a few good prospects, and we're hoping to develop as many options as there can be. We don't want to count our chickens before they're hatched,
Indeed. Well, Mr. Erhard Koehler, thank you for taking time today to discuss the nuclear ship Savannah with the Talk a Little, Learn a Lot audience. I hope that listeners will come and visit on one of the days that you have tours or an open house.
Thank you, Steve. I really appreciate the opportunity. And I'll tell you what, we'll get you the dates of the tours, so maybe you can post them on the website.
I'll do that. Thanks.
All right. Thank you.